In this Dragon's Dogma 2 video, we're going to be taking a look at the Sorcerer Vocation. We're going to be talking about how to play a Sorcerer, what are the best spells for a Sorcerer, what are the mechanics that make Sorcerer different than Mage, and of course, how to get Sorcerer in the game. So if you've been wanting some tips on how to play your Sorcerer or just how to play it better, watch on for some useful information. So the role of the Sorcerer is kind of the artillery of the group. They're going to hang back and unleash devastating AoE spells into enemies that often take a very long time to cast, which means that they have to have their positioning very well in hand so that they're not interrupted when they're casting, where they can waste a lot of time and not do a lot of damage. So you definitely need to have your party set up so that enemies are distracted by your melee units and that you can hang back and attack. Means that a very good pawn pairing for Sorcerer would be something like Fighter or Warrior that's going to keep the attention of enemies on them while you're able to hang back and just unleash these devastating spells. Now the Sorcerer casts their spells exactly the same way the Mage does, so if you've been playing Mage and then swapped to Sorcerer, you should be familiar with the mechanics of this. However, they do have one unique thing about them. Instead of having Anodyne in order to heal around them, which is something that, mages have, they have something called Galvanize, which allows them to hold the triangle or Y button and regain stamina very, very quickly. And this is very, very useful inside and outside of combat because a lot of their spells take a lot of stamina to cast, and they can quickly top themselves up using Galvanize and then unload another huge spell. And obviously, when you're running around on the landscape, you are sprinting most of the time, so you tend to drain your stamina, and you can quickly use Galvanize to top yourself back off and then keep sprinting again. So this is a very, very useful skill, and it's one of the things that separates mages from sorcerers, besides the fact that sorcerers are more offensively oriented than mages, and you're going to want to get the hang of using Galvanize as much as you can. And also a nice thing about Galvanize as well is it allows you to move while you're using it. Obviously not very quickly, but you can move out of the way of an attack if you see it coming while you're using Galvanize, or if you're running on the landscape, you can keep moving forward so you're not standing perfectly still. And obviously another big part of playing Sorcerer, just like playing Mage, is that you're going to be using Quick Spell. You're going to be using the R1 button by default unless you remapped it while you're casting spells to cast them more quickly in order to get some of these long casting spells off. And this will consume more stamina, but because you have Galvanize on Sorcerer, it's absolutely worth doing. It's worth doing on Mage anyway, but it's even more worth it on Sorcerer because of the Galvanize ability. So make sure you're using Quick Spell and you're casting as fast as you can when you're casting spells. And just like mages, sorcerers have the levitate ability, allowing them to float in the air to kind of get away from enemies when they jump, or it's very useful also in exploration when you're out on the landscape. Maybe you need to get between two high up points, but a running jump just isn't enough, and you can float for a few seconds to get over to things. So that's really nice to have on Sorcerer as well. So let's talk a little bit about stamina and how it applies to the Sorcerer. Stamina is super important for all classes, but Sorcerers in particular have to manage their stamina very effectively because their spells cost so much stamina. And one thing that you can do, even though I don't do it, is if you find you're accidentally sprinting a lot in combat, this will drain your stamina. You can take it from toggle and turn it in the settings from toggle to hold so that you don't accidentally sprint. I don't do this because I find it very annoying on the landscape to have to hold the circle button down. But if you do find you're having stamina problems in combat, it might be worth changing until you can get the hang of managing your stamina a bit better. The next thing is Levitate is very fun to use and it's very useful in combat, but if you're using it all the time, you'll find yourself wasting time that you could be regenerating stamina. So try not to use it any more than you need to in combat. And the next thing is make sure your Sorcerer is not very heavy. Make sure that they're not carrying too much equip load, that you offload some of your stuff onto your pawns to make them lighter. This will make it so that their stamina regen is faster, so they can get back to casting spells more quickly after casting them. And also keep in mind that making a smaller Sorcerer will give you faster stamina regeneration. So it might be a good idea to make a smaller Sorcerer if you plan on making one in order to have faster stamina regen in combat. And then lastly, another thing that you can do is you can use items or consumables to replenish your stamina if you have any in your inventory. That will allow you to regain some stamina quickly in combat and continue to cast spells. Okay, so those things being said, let's talk about the spells that I like to use on Sorcerer. The first one is High Leaven. This is the same spell that you can get on the Mage, and it's kind of the bread and butter of Mage's offensive spells. And it's a very good spell for Sorcerers as well, mainly because it has such a quick cast time compared to some of the other spells they can cast. It's also a very good AoE. and it also attacks directly above the target, making it very difficult for enemies to block these attacks. So High Levin is one that I absolutely recommend on all sorcerers, and it's going to be kind of one that if you need to get a spell off quickly in the thick of combat, you don't have time to stand there for 5 to 6 seconds to cast a spell, you're going to use it. And make sure you use Quick Spell when using it to get it off even more quickly. Another spell that I really like is High Haggle. This is one that's unique to sorcerers. The mages don't have this. This kind of creates an icy dome in an AoE that does damage and also can freeze enemies, which CCs them so they can't do anything while your party attacks them. This is a really, really good AoE, and I find it works particularly well against big targets or large groups of targets, which is basically everything that you're fighting in this game. So consider using that one if you need like a source of like ice damage or whatever. That's a good one to have. I also really like the Salamander spell because it puts fire on the ground that can damage enemies over time and also set them on fire, which does even more damage. But it has a couple negatives. It takes a little bit of a long time to cast, and also it has kind of a narrow swath that it does in front of you. Like the cone that it does is pretty narrow, and I find that a lot of times enemies will just move out of it very quickly. But still, if you like knock a monster down, it's a good spell to drop on them while they can't move. But you might want to consider swapping it out if you're having a hard time actually landing it on enemies. Another really good spell to get on your sorcerer eventually is Seism. This is a physical damage spell, which is really nice against enemies that resist magic types of damage, like golems or something like that. So you're definitely going to want to have a spell like this in your repertoire that can deal with these situations. Otherwise, you won't be very effective, because unlike a mage, who in that scenario could just go to like healing and buffing the group because they can't use their 1 or 2 offensive spells effectively, you basically have all offensive spells. So you definitely want to have at least one spell that does physical damage. If I'm not mistaken, Maelstrom also does physical damage. It's very effective against golems in my testing. And it's another one that you could swap Seism out for once you get. This is like a super ultra powerful spell that you'll get pretty early on in the game from the questing. And it has like a really, really, really long cast time that cannot be sped up with quick cast. So you really got to be set up in order to cast it, but it does devastating damage. And it's really good at like hitting enemies like golems or dragons in their weak spots, because it's basically hitting all of them at once. So that's another one I can recommend. You probably want one of those 2 spells. Another spell that I can highly recommend is the Prescient Flare spell. This casts like a ball on enemies that then, if you keep attacking, does more and more damage and then explodes, dealing damage. This can deal a lot of damage if you do it on like an enemy that's vulnerable. That's like knocked on the ground, and you throw it on their head and then you attack into it. When it explodes, it can deal tons and tons of damage and kill them very, very quickly. So highly recommend this one as well. When it comes to augments for this build, there's a couple good ones. There's one that increases the chance to inflict debilitations, which is really nice because you're trying to do that a lot as a sorcerer. And there's also a good one from Mage that also increases your stamina recovery. If you were playing Mage earlier, Mage's Exaltation, you have that can be really good, because obviously stamina recovery is very important. And then there's also Catalyst, which helps you make increased damage against the elemental weaknesses of enemies, which is good. But there's a lot of good ones you could get. Primarily you're looking for like stamina recovery and damage. Those are really the 2 things that sorcerers need to be worried about. And when it comes to equipment, obviously you're going to want to use the best staff that you can. Some staffs are inherently buffed with elements, so like they can build up like burning when they attack normally, which is quite nice. I would recommend just worrying about, maximum magic stat on one if you can. Make sure you upgrade your staff as well. The Checkpoint Rest Town has a nice one early on called the Goblin Staff that you can get. It's not too expensive. So that one's a pretty good one early on. And rings-wise, you want anything that further boosts stamina recovery, which there is a ring that does this, or it increases your magic stat for further damage. Basically anything that increases your damage. You just want to be able to do as much damage as possible. You're not really worried about protection as a sorcerer. You want to hang back and just nuke basically enemies from the back, and hopefully your melee units are doing their job keeping aggro, and you can just keep doing that over and over while dodging the occasional, mechanic, basically. So that kind of wraps up our video on Sorcerer. Sorcerers play somewhat similarly to mages. Obviously, they use the same casting mechanics. Sorcerers are way more offensive than mages because they don't heal and they don't really have buffs the way that mages do. So if you like playing a mage but you want to be more offensive, then Sorcerer is definitely the way to go. You can get this class from doing the Vocation Frustration quest in Vernworth, which is not very far into the game at all, by giving the Vocation Guild guy there an arch staff that you find, and that basically unlocks it. So you can get this pretty early on in the game. That and Warrior are both unlocked very early, so it doesn't take long to get either. As always, if you have tips that I forgot to mention, please leave them in the comments, and if you have questions about things, ask them here as well, and I will try and answer them as soon as I can.